Hey, welcome to our penultimate edition of AP Current English. Today we're going to talk about Great Expectations, chapters 15 through 18. Here we go. All right, let's start off by talking about chapter 15 here. So Pip is recounting how Biddy gives his education to him after Mr. Wopsel's great aunt dies. And there's really not all that's going on there, but we see that Pip is really interested in his education. And the reason he says, this is on page 109 in the hardcover, that whatever I acquired, I tried to impart to Joe. The statement sounds so well that I cannot in my conscience let it pass unexplained. I wanted to make Joe less ignorant in common, that he might be worthier of my society and less open to Estella's reproach. Right, so not only does he want it for himself to be better for Estella, but he also wants it for Joe. And there are two parts that I find really interesting there. The first is the elitism he has. He says that Joe will be more worthy of Pip's company if he's more educated. Pip's getting a big head, which at this point he has no reason to at all, other than he spent some time with Estella and Miss Havisham. Secondly, right, it shows that he's really ashamed of Joe. As we read on and throughout the whole book, I don't feel it's a spoiler to say, I think Joe is the single best character, right? He is the most good of everyone. There are some who are also all good, but he's not without flaws, but pretty close. So it's really showing, as Pip's eyes, look up to bigger and better things, he's maybe sinking down a little bit otherwise. And so we go on a little bit and we see a habit of Pip's, right? And this is on 110. He talks, and he's talking about the sales and what they remind him of, and it brings him back to Miss Havisham and Estella at that strange house, and the strange life appeared to have something to do with everything that was picturesque, which shows his habit of romanticizing the past, making more of things than are actually there. We as readers, of course, see that there's nothing picturesque about Miss Havisham and Estella, right? Estella is cruel to him, and that strange house is decaying and falling apart and is full of bugs and mice and has stopped back in time. And Miss Havisham herself is decaying in that way. So it's a bit of an ironic statement because we as readers can see the opposite, but we also see how Pip has this habit of doing that. His experiences, he builds into more than what they are. But regardless, right, Pip is, at this point, apprenticed to Joe in the forge as a blacksmith. And we know that he wants half a day off because he wants to go see Miss Havisham. Or at least that's what he tells Joe. We know, of course, he really wants to go see Estella. And we then meet a new character, and that's Orlick. Orlick, who is described as slouchy, right? Slouches around all the time, and swarthy, which means he has dark skin. Is this some kind of prejudice? Because we see Pip present Orlick as a negative character, and is that dark skin being tied to it? So do we see some of Dickens' his prejudices come out here? We know that Dickens utilizes like names to kind of show who the character is and the way they look as well. That's a possibility, just a thought to keep in your mind as you continue to read. But Pip brings it up again while Orlick is around, is wanting a half day off, and Orlick says, hey, if he's getting a half day off, I should get a half day off too, which is a totally reasonable request. And I think we should recognize that he's in the right here. Of course, Mrs. Joe hears about this. Well, first off, Joe says, be glad to talk to you about it when you're calmed down, because he starts off, he's angry about it. because Orlick is quick-tempered. He's certainly, Pip says, mistreated Pip, like when he was younger. Used to talk about like the devil in the forge and that sort of thing. And Pip has a bad take on him, right? He says he blames Orlick for saying that his Christian name is Dolge, right? And how could that be? And that idea then is that the name Dolge, D-O-L-G-E, wouldn't have been a name that someone would have been christened with at this time period. There's like a list of, kind of acceptable Victorian Christian names, like George and Sam and Philip and those kinds of things. Often biblical, but not always. So we see that, that this choice for Dolge is an affront to people. That's what Pip says. We as modern readers think that's kind of a strange thing. Now, what's he saying with that? I don't really know. We certainly know that he doesn't like Pip, but the idea that that is Orlick's first name, is this an actual first name? Probably not. Is he being kind of outcast as unchristian somehow for this? Maybe. I don't really know. Anyway, Orlick responds to Joe. He's saying, "I want this day off," and he's really angry about it. And Joe says, "Hey, when you calm down, we can talk about this," which is fair. But then Mrs. Joe, of course, gets in the middle of it and is putting everyone down and making a conflict where making it worse, to the point where Joe says basically he's going to have to stand up for his wife and beats Orlick. Okay. It is worth noting, though, that after that's done, Pip sees Joe and Orlick drinking a beer together, right? So it was, once that's done, it's done. We can move on and go on from there, right? And again, Joe is like the best character, the most good. Anyway, so Pip goes and he gets that half day and he goes to see Miss Havisham, and of course she thinks that he wants money, but he doesn't. But really, he goes to see Estella, and of course Estella is gone abroad to be educated, probably to France, and so she's not there, which of course brings Pip down, because that's really what he wanted to see, and he wanted to talk to her. On his way back, he sees Mr. Wopsle, and they go have tea at Pumblechook's. And Wopsle tells him or makes him listen to parts from a play called The London Merchant, and he talks about George Barnwell. And that play, it's a tragedy. Great Expectations is not a tragedy, but The London Merchant is a tragedy. And George Barnwell was an apprentice who was seduced by kind of a heartless woman, they kind of plot and kill his uncle and then are executed for it, right? And so there's some similarities here. Pip is also an apprentice. He has, in a way, been seduced by Estella, who does seem heartless. And as we see just after this, his aunt, or his sister, not his aunt, has been attacked, right? So there's a similarity to murder there, and Dickens does this a lot with allusions that matter in terms, bring more meaning to the story. Anyway, as he leaves there, right, he sees Orlick around, and they hear the cannons from the hulks, meaning that a convict has escaped. And those of you who are fans of Law and Order or Criminal Minds or that sort of thing, right, we have a mystery here, because we then find out that Mrs. Joe has been attacked. And so we have clues, right, with the cannon going off, with Orlick being in town, and those kinds of things. And so they rush back and they find that Mrs. Joe has been attacked. Okay, so on to chapter 16. And 16 is pretty short. It it exists, I think, to kind of deepen the intrigue about what happens to Mrs. Joe. We get some clues. We hear the story about Joe being at the Three Jolly Bargemen, and then hearing that that Mrs. Joe had been attacked. And Pip assumes it's either Orlick, because they had been in a fight earlier that day. But of course, everyone gets in a fight with Mrs. Joe because she is not the most pleasant of characters. Or it's the strange man who showed Pip the file from a few chapters back and gave Pip the £2. And the reason that is because we find out that she was attacked with a leg iron that was taken from the leg of my convict, right? That Pip had helped him get out, right? And this kind of brings back some of Pip's guilt, which is a constant. It's a constant thing in Pip's life throughout the whole thing is his guilt, and whether it's over. Helping out a convict and stealing from his family, whether it's about lying to his family, to Joe, or as we'll continue to see, he does have guilt about the way he treats Joe and the way he's ashamed of him, despite the fact that Joe is such a good guy. So we continue on, and we find out that Wopsel's great aunt has died. Which means that Biddy, still being a teenager probably at this point, has no place to live. So she comes and she stays with Joe and Pip to take care of Mrs. Joe and do the domestic duties for the house. And we see her interactions a little bit, and hopefully we recognize that she's a lot smarter than Pip. When Mrs. Joe she writes a T that seems to refer to Orlick, or actually they don't know who it refers to. Biddy's the one who says, obviously, it's a hammer, not a T, and it refers to Orlick. We notice that Mrs. Joe changes the way she acts when Orlick comes around. It's almost as if she's afraid of him. I don't know why that would be. She's all of a sudden very, very nice to Orlick, as if she has something to fear. I don't know, all of you Law & Order fans or Criminal Minds fans, I'm sure, are trying to put together the clues. Who could it be? Who could have attacked Mrs. Joe? And in here, there's a little bit of satire of the various police forces that would have been around. Evidently, Dickens doesn't think all that much of them. So, there we go. All right, so on to Chapter 17. And Chapter 17 is mainly between Pip and Estella. And we see that there's a bit of time that's gone on. We know it's actually a few years. Pip talks about the guinea he gets when he sees Miss Havisham on his birthday. And he... when he's talking about Biddy or talking to Biddy and complimenting her, saying that she's very clever, he says, I spent my birthday guineas on his knowledge. That's on page 126. So evidently this is a number of years. How many exactly, we don't know. Is it 2, 3, 4, something like that. But it's definitely fallen into a routine. Pip as apprentice, Biddy living there with them, Estella abroad, learning elsewhere in Europe. So we know that a little bit of time has gone by. In this part, we also see how close Pip and Biddy are. Biddy does kind of act as Pip's confidant, if not more. One of the things he does is he confides that he wants to be a gentleman. And Pip actually has an internal conflict over this, because on one hand he's seen better things. I'm using quotes there because I'm not sure. I agree that they're better. But he's seen the wealth of Miss Havisham and Estella, and now he wants that. He's dissatisfied with his life, and the conflict is both his lack of satisfaction, but also his ingratitude. And it's been kind of pounded in his head his whole life that he should be more gracious for what people have done for him. And I mean, it is true. People have done a lot for him, and they should be gracious. He should be gracious, but he has this conflict, and he tells Biddy that he wants to be a gentleman, and she replies, this is page 127 in the hardcover, "Oh, I wouldn't if I was you," she returned. "I don't think it would answer." Biddy, said I with some severity, "I have particular reasons for wanting to be a gentleman." "You know best, Pip, but don't you think you're happier as you are?" And he confides that he's not happy. He's not happy with his life. And she basically says that's a pity, that he's not happy because she thinks he has a good life. It's worth noting that this comes immediately after Pip goes through telling her how clever she is. And he says, either you're very clever or I'm very dumb. Either way, he ought to be listening to her. But there's something about him that he can't be happy with what he has, which is a problem. And he talks about his vanity of his knowledge here, that he's become vain of it. And we see some of this arrogance coming out when he's saying to Biddy, let's see, "I might even have grown up to keep company with you, and we might have sat on this very bank on a fine Sunday, quite different people. I should have been good enough for you, shouldn't I, Biddy?" Which suggests that maybe he has some attraction to her, right? He talks about how beautiful her eyes are at one point. But he does it in a really kind of arrogant and silly, not foolish, stupid sort of way. And he's putting her down, and Biddy sighs. She looked at the ship sailing on and returned for an answer. "Yes, I'm not over particular." It scarcely sounded flattering. And it's not supposed to be flattering, right? Because she's just been put down. But Pip can't help but think of Estella. On a side note, it's worth noting that we have Pip, whose name is Philip, right, and Estella, and Dickens used the poem by Sir Philip Sidney, Astrophil and Stella, for the title and some of the character names in this. Now, Astrophil, Phil, Philip, Pip. Astrophil means star lover. Astrophil, like Phil, as in philosophy, lover of wisdom. There are other things, like the Phil is a Greek root that means love. And Estella, Stella, right? So that's where the names came from, and it's an unrequited love in the poems as well. But he can never really get there. So he's in love with her, and he doesn't even know why, right? But that's why he wants to be a gentleman, is for her. And Biddy asks to spite her or to gain her over, and Pip doesn't even know because he's just kind of obsessed. And there's the excuse almost. But how could I, a poor dazed village lad, avoid the wonderful inconsistency into which the best and wisest of men fall every day? And that is, falling in love with either what we can't have or things that are really not the best for us. And that certainly seems to be what Pip has done here. But it really is kind of funny that Pip I don't know, he's such a typical high schooler, I guess. On one hand, he claims to be in love with Estella, and he is infatuated with her, and he refuses to, pay attention to his friend that he has a very good relationship with. But when he finds out that Orlick likes Estella, he kind of becomes jealous and protects her, and is unhappy to hear that Orlick dances at her and that kind of thing. And so it's really it's a conflict that Pip doesn't recognize, unfortunately. I say unfortunately. The book would be over pretty much if that were the case, if they just got together and lived happily ever after. But anyway, there we go. Okay, so chapter 18. A lot of change happens here. We start off with everyone, or the men at least, at the Jolly Bargemen, where they are they're discussing a court case that Mr. Wopsle is reading aloud, and there are a lot of allusions to there's a couple Shakespearean plays, Timon of Athens and Coriolanus. And so they're discussing this murder case, and this guy whose name we find out as Jaggers kind of interrupts them and cross-examines them, really, or at least cross-examines Wopsle. And it's interesting because I think what's going on here is there's some satire about kind of the public fascination with court cases and with the justice system and with crime. And all of you who watch Criminal Minds know what I'm talking about. And so there's that, and there's some criticism of that because people don't hear the full story. And he points out that the witnesses haven't been cross-examined, and so they are they're jumping to conclusions, and they're making up their own mind before there's even a jury. And aren't we also guilty of that when we read about crime in the paper, on the internet, and that sort of thing? We come to conclusions without without a court of law. Anyway, so it starts off that way. It's at this point that Pip finds out about his great expectations, and that line is actually used, right? And so it's the expectation of wealth to be given to him. It's not given to him all at once, but he ends up with this unknown benefactor who is giving this large inheritance to. And there's a few conditions. The first is that Pip always goes by Pip, and the second is that Pip doesn't try to discover the identity of his benefactor. And that's a curious thing, right? We have another mystery, much like the mystery of who attacked Mrs. Joe. Now, certainly we can come to conclusions, and Pip, knowing only one wealthy person, can only come to one conclusion here. But anyway, it's interesting. Jaggers and Joe are talking about Pip's great expectations, and Joe loves Pip so much, right? He's willing to let Pip go, and this is something that Pip wants. And Joe's insulted by the idea that he would receive some money for this. And he actually gets angry, and to the point where Jaggers finds him threatening, which is interesting in itself, because Jaggers is an imposing character, but he seems to be then afraid of the physical prowess of Joe. But Pip and Joe's relationship then, the fact that it's the love that Joe has for Pip shows that the relationship as, friend, father, son, whatever you want to call it, is far more important to Joe than the relationship as an apprentice. So we see a lot of the worst of Pip coming out here. And he's probably, I don't know, maybe 18 years old, 18, 19, something like that. But he talks about as he's going to get closed, right? He doesn't want the people in town to see him and this kind of thing, because he now feels that he's better than everyone else, and he doesn't want to be brought down by them. And so he really is becoming arrogant and insufferable in a lot of ways. He's acting like there are not words that I can use on this video for me to express how he acts, but very, very arrogant for sure. And it's not something that he doesn't realize, or at least the narration, right? The narrator as older Pip realizes that he is acting this way. As the chapter ends, he says, "I put my light out and crept into bed, and it was an uneasy bed now, and I never slept the old sound sleep in it anymore." Because he is ashamed of these surroundings that he is in and ashamed of that life. In contrast to the way when he was younger, when he loved it, and it was something really good for him. But these aspirations that he has now to be a gentleman and to somehow be part of Estella's life later, those are now in his head, and it makes everything else bad, and he's ashamed and appalled by everything else. So there we have it. There is chapter 18.